Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from the Aberdeen Standard Investments Research Institute. My name's Paul Diggle. I'm a senior economist at Aberdeen Standard and co-host of the podcast. And today we're talking about China, its handling of the coronavirus crisis, the immediate economic outlook, its role in the world, its relationship with the US post the election outcome, and the stability or otherwise of its economic, political and financial model. And to do that, we're really lucky to be joined by Tom Orlik, who's chief economist at Bloomberg. And before that, he was chief Asia economist there. And at Aberdeen Standard, we're keen readers of the Bloomberg research. And Tom's also worked at the Wall Street Journal in the UK Treasury. And for a long time, he was based in Beijing and he's now in Washington, D.C. It's obviously been a huge week in D.C. But as I say, the main focus today is China. And Tom is a very deep expert in China. And he has a book out earlier this year called China, the Bubble That Never Pops. And the main thesis of the book is that outside observers often get China wrong. They think it's a debt-ridden economy on the cusp of collapse. And Tom argues that a proper understanding of the structure and functioning of the Chinese economic, political, financial system sort of shows you why that is an oversimplification of what's really going on in China. So it's a really interesting, nuanced examination of the Chinese economy. And we're also joined from within Aberdeen Standard by Bob Gilhooly, our senior EM economist, who's our in-house China watcher. He's a previous guest on this podcast, and he was previously head of China forecasting at the Bank of England. So a really great couple of Chinese economists to join us for this conversation.
There's a huge amount of debt being accrued by everyone because, you know, when people can't get a loan from the bank, they go to shadow banks or they borrow from family or whatever.
Right.
And everyone's, you know, they're investing, they've got tons of property and all this other kind of nonsense, right? But they actually, that's it. They've got all these things, but it's all kind of propped up by debt. And It's not something that Chinese people are used to dealing with. They haven't really had this in the past, you know?
People have always had like savings and no debt.
So I think it's a lot more dangerous than we think.
So Tom, let's start by talking about why China has continuously proved the doom-mongers wrong. What are the designs of the Chinese system which mean that the financial stresses that people often point to in China haven't built up to the point where they've derailed the Chinese economy?
Well, first of all, let me say thanks very much for having me on the podcast, Paul. Great to be here and looking forward to the conversation with you and Bob. Let me talk about the big thesis of my book. I was in China for 11 years, from 2007 through to 2018. And for that entire time, there was this thread of doom running through the Western analysis of the Chinese economy. And most of it was related to debt. In response to the great financial crisis, China launched an enormous credit-fueled stimulus, which was very successful in preventing China going into recession. But once they turned the stimulus taps on, Beijing found it very hard to turn them off. So what you saw from 2008 on is just a massive buildup of debt in China. The ratio of outstanding borrowing to GDP went from around 150% in 2000 and 2007 all the way up to 250% pretty quickly. And if you look at where that lending was going, well, a lot of it was going to low quality borrowers. You had state-owned enterprises borrowing a lot of money, investing in overcapacity industries like steel and cement. You had real estate developers borrowing a lot of money, some of them wasting it by building empty developments, ghost towns they were called. And you had local governments borrowing a lot of money, some of them wasting it on lavish new offices for themselves or building infrastructure which looked great, but maybe the demand wasn't there to make it to generate enough revenue to repay the loans. So that's the kind of the lens through which most Western observers view China. Too much debt, taken on too quickly, and the debt allocated to low quality borrowers. And we've seen that happen before. We saw it in Asian countries in the run up to the Asian financial crisis in 1997. We saw it in the US in the run-up to the Lehman shock. We saw it in some European countries in the run-up to the European sovereign debt crisis. So the assumption is China's kind of following the same pattern. We know how this movie ends. China's going to have a crisis as well. So that's the kind of the story that we hear from a lot of Wall Street analysts, a lot of the international financial institutions, a lot of the financial press. And of course, there's important elements of truth to that story, but the crisis never seems to come. And as we continue to tell ourselves that story, China's growth continues, China's wealth continues to rise, China's global influence continues to expand. So what I tried to do in my book was to sort of explain why. Why is this crisis never arriving? Why does China always seem to be able to kick the can a bit further down the road? And the big answers I came up with were, well, firstly, yes, there's a lot of problems on the asset side of banks' balance sheets. They've made a lot of loans. There's probably a lot more bad loans than the official data suggest. But on the funding side of banks' balance sheets, they're really very stable. China has a high savings rate. The money can't exit the country easily, so it all builds up in bank deposits. And banks that have a stable funding base don't normally fall over. Second big reason is China's policymakers, they don't get everything right. But on economic and financial policy, they actually get more right than we give them credit for. In particular, they've pushed ahead with interest rate liberalization and exchange rate liberalization, which have a kind of catalytic effect on driving efficiency gains across the economy. And they moved early to address some of the big problems in the financial sector. They launched what they call the deleveraging agenda. They didn't quite manage to delever, but they did manage to de-risk important parts of China's shadow banking industry. And the third reason is we kind of treat China, when we think about financial crisis in China, we sort of treat them as if they're already a developed economy. We kind of think of them in the same way we think of Japan in 1989, for example. But China's not a developed economy. China is still a middle-income economy. Perhaps we'll talk more about that later. GDP per capita is still very low relative to the United States. And what that means is China just has space to grow by catching up to the technology frontier. And that means they don't have as much room to grow through their problems as they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but they've still got some room to grow through their problems.
Brilliant, Tom. That's a really useful summary of the book. Maybe I'll bring Bob in here. Bob, do you think there is a sense in which the sustainable debt carrying load that a lot of analysts thought China could sustain is higher than we sort of perhaps previously thought it was?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And as Tom just mentioned there, that was one of the kind of key concerns about China, particularly after the global financial crisis. We saw that massive run up in credit growth, as Tom mentioned, and the stylized fact that was doing the rounds, and still does to some extent, is that there are almost no countries that have seen a sort of credit to GDP rise by more than around 60 percentage points, as China's actually exceeded and then not have a crisis. But I think that is kind of being put to the test a bit by China. China's credit surge to that sort of 60 percentage point mark was a few years ago now, and still no crisis. And then, of course, I guess following on from the COVID shock, globally debt levels are going to be much higher. So, maybe what we're learning here is a little bit that it's not just China, but maybe kind of globally this capacity to carry debt is somewhat higher, or at least, the sort of any day of reckoning is a bit further out too.
Mm-hmm. Tom, one of the other explanations I sometimes hear for why China is able to continually surprise doom-mongers to the upside, in addition to the sort of drivers you were describing, is that the sheer number of levers that policymakers have to pull and the sort of variety of tools that you can use to influence the financial system, also the close interconnectedness of monetary, fiscal, structural policy, Is that another feature of the system that gives China the inbuilt advantage when it comes to policy making?
Yeah, so there's a brittleness that comes from having a single party state, right? In the long term, I do not think this is going to be a source of strength for China. But in the period of time that I cover in my book, the reform period through now, in the sort of medium term ahead, the capacity of China's policymakers to pull an array of policy levers is certainly something which enables them to manage risk within the system. They also, I would add, have a kind of a philosophical difference with Western policymakers on two dimensions. So the first is they really don't care about moral hazard. If given a choice between wading in and fixing a problem at the expense of increasing moral hazard, or letting something break at the expense of teaching everybody that defaults can happen and they should manage their risk, they almost always err on the side of wading in. And the second thing is, and I guess this is a sort of related point, they really don't have sort of a philosophical predisposition to think that the market has the right answers and they should let the market arrive at its own solution. One place you can see this incredibly vividly is in the real estate sector. I'm sure Bob knows from his time covering China that real estate has been this kind of persistent concern for the China bears, right? And for good reason. There's just massive overbuilding in China's real estate sector. And if the market were left to its own devices, well, you've got too much supply, you've got not enough demand. The result should be a collapse in real estate. And because real estate is, looms very large on banks' balance sheets, that could trigger a financial crisis, as we saw in the US in 2007, 2008, and we've seen in lots of other countries. But China didn't let the market arrive at its own solution. China weighed in incredibly aggressively. They had what was kind of euphemistically called a slum clearance program. And that sounds quite nice, right? No one wants to live in a slum. But in fact, what it meant was the government went around the country and every year they tore down millions and millions of houses, and they compensated the people who lived in the houses with enough money to move into a new apartment. And that kind of massive nationwide intervention actually substantially redressed the balance of supply and demand in the real estate market. And it's meant that so far, that sort of day of reckoning for real estate, which could, at some point trigger a financial day of reckoning for China, just hasn't arrived.
And I was going to just jump in there, echo some of the points that Tom's made. And for those of you who have not had a chance to read Tom's book, he's got a very nice analogy with real estate being sort of one of the wobbly legs on a stool, with the possibility of kind of bringing down either state-owned enterprises or kind of local governments as the value of kind of land potentially drops. I want to just quickly pick up on one related point that you make, Tom, and I think this is kind of going back to the sort of, you could maybe call it sort of peak China bearishness around 2015-16. And around that sort of time there was also a strand of, I guess, academic growth literature. The school of thought was very much that China's growth was a puzzle. Given the apparent weakness of its institutions, it just shouldn't have been able to grow, I guess, as fast as it was growing. But I think, maybe one thing we have learned is the machinery of governance is maybe arguably stronger and maybe a bit more capable of learning and adapting than some of the metrics used in these sort of academic studies would be able to capture. And I think China's policy response to the COVID crisis is arguably one example of this. While most countries have kind of adopted support measures much greater than that deployed after the global financial crisis, China's been much more restrained. Work I did with colleagues in the research institute here, peg it around about sort of a third or half of the sort of reaction that we saw in the global financial crisis. And while credit relative to GDP has accelerated somewhat, particularly in that kind of early stage of this year, the overall policy response has been one in which the PBOC has very much held the line on financial system de-risking, bank claims on non-bank financial institutions are little changed, and this is definitely a big marked change to how they reacted, both after the global financial crisis and also after this 2015-16 slowdown, when credit growth and financial linkages in both instances expanded, very rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that if we think about China's sort of the effectiveness of China's policymaking institutions, there are some big examples where having sort of rigid institutions where there are not processes to kind of take in feedback and assimilate public opinion lead to some really, really serious policy errors, right? So I would point to the one-child policy as an example of a policy which has had some extremely negative consequences on Chinese society, and will have some long-time negative impact on China's economy because of the disastrous demographic impact. And I also think that the one-child policy would not have been a policy which a democratic government would adopt. And if they did adopt it, they'd drop it really quickly because they would know they would immediately be voted out of office. But China had it and pursued it for decades. So there are some rigidities in the policy process that cause some serious problems. But if we look at economic and financial policy over the last 20 years, longer, I think it's actually a sort of fairly striking record of success. I mentioned interest rate liberalization and exchange rate liberalization. The interest rate, which sets the price of money, the exchange rate, which sets the price of foreign and domestic goods, these are the two most important levers in the economy. If you went and spoke to a China economist in 2000, 2002, 2004, they would say these are the two biggest problems. Interest rate, exchange rate, they're both set by the government. They need to be set by the market. Over the last 15 years, China's made that happen. So when I think about China's economic and financial policymakers, I actually think about sort of a group who are sort of pretty effective. They're cautious, they're incremental, but they move the dial in the right direction and they get things done.
So why don't we get into this issue of the long-term growth outlook then? Because Tom, you highlight both helpful structural reforms that Chinese policymakers have engaged in, but also some long-term brittleness in the system, as you called it. How do you balance those two conflicting forces off from each other in terms of projecting sort of the long-term trend growth rate of China, perhaps 5, 10, 15 years out? And I ask this question in the context of the fate that a lot of people, a lot of economists project for sort of middle-income countries, which is that they stagnate at the middle income level and they never complete that final catch up to that you were talking about at the start that China's sort of taking advantage of at the moment. So how does all that balance out for the long-term growth outlook?
There's a huge range of opinions out there on China's medium-term growth prospects. We've just seen President Xi Jinping saying he wants to double the size of the economy by 2035. I think that would require annual growth in the next 15 years averaging close to 5%. That's at the sort of the top end of estimates of where China could grow out in the next 10, 20 years. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got people like Lawrence Summers and Lant Pritchett, who got a lot of attention a few years ago with a big kind of data-driven study where they said, well, look, China's just going to revert to the mean of global growth, and that points to growth coming quite quickly down to low single digits. So why have we got this huge range between the optimists and the pessimists? And of course, some people even more pessimistic, saying there's going to be a financial crisis coming, and don't even talk about growth. China's going into a deep recession sometime in the near future. Well, I think there's just different ways of thinking about it, right? So if we think about where China is in terms of its development position on the sort of development ladder, GDP per capita is a third of the level in the United States. If we think about what Japan and Korea and other Asian countries did when they were at a similar point on the development ladder, they had more than a decade of strong growth ahead of them. So on that basis, we would say, yes, China's got some distance still to travel. They've got some strong years of growth ahead of them. On the other hand, if we look at if we think about where the demand is going to come from, well, China has already exceeded the share of global exports, which Japan hit at its peak. And we see the pushback, right? We see the US imposing tariffs. We see rising concern in some European countries. So maybe exporting their way to prosperity is going to be hard from now on. And when we look at the debt levels and the investment levels, well, China's already borrowed a very, very large amount of money and already has an economy which is unbalanced towards investment. So maybe the investment driver isn't going to be there either. And consumption, well, the Chinese consumption story remains kind of a strong story, but it's not something which kind of accelerates very quickly overnight, right? That's something which takes time to develop. So it kind of depends on the perspective that you take. You can come up with a more optimistic number. You can come up with a more pessimistic number. I'm at the more optimistic end of the spectrum, mainly because of where China is in the development, on the sort of development ladder. Also because I think China's policymakers have kind of, being at a low level of development in itself is not a guarantee you're going to grow quickly, right? A lot of African countries are at a low level of development. Most people don't expect them to grow quickly because their institutions just aren't there. China, I think, has demonstrated in the last 30 or 40 years that it does have the economic and financial policy institutions which enable it to capitalize on its growth potential, and I expect it to continue doing so.
So, Tom and Bob, I want to ask you guys about China's performance during the coronavirus crisis and why it's had a good crisis. But perhaps before that, has it had a good crisis? I think we all sort of assume that because China is able to control the virus so successfully, it must have had a good crisis. But I look at sort of international survey evidence of sentiment towards China, and that seems to have fallen, at least in Western economies during the coronavirus crisis. There obviously is the simple fact that the virus appears to have originated in China in the first place, which does a sort of form of reputational damage. So, Tom, has China had a good crisis?
So I think there's two ways of looking at it, right? So the first way is, has China effectively managed the virus at home and got its economy going again? And the answer to that is clearly yes. Many countries in Europe, the United States, have not successfully contained the virus, and as a consequence face a deep contraction in growth in 2020 and uncertain prospects in 2021 ahead of what everyone really hopes for, which is the widespread availability of a vaccine. China, even though it was the first to go into this crisis, managed the spread of the virus pretty effectively. They now have, I think, close to zero community spread. The economy is back to life. They'll be the only major economy that grows this year. Next year, we think they'll grow around 8%. So in that sort of very straightforward way, yes, they've had a successful crisis. Now, it's also the diplomatic aspects of it have been less successful, right? So the COVID crisis has clearly worsened US-China relations. The US is blaming China as the origin of the virus for not being transparent enough in the early days of the virus. China's diplomatic efforts as the virus spread around the world were regarded by some as kind of ham-fisted. So in terms of sort of diplomatic standing, international reputation, it's not been as successful for China as it has been in terms of their capacity to contain the virus and get their economy back to life.
Yeah, and I guess on the kind of short-term impact, it has been. I think it has been very impressive how quickly China's kind of got back to some degree of normality. And one striking aspect about this is there's always a lot of skepticism out there about kind of how fast is China really going? Is the data misleading. But I think the general consensus out there at the moment is, even if you want to put a bit of sort of pinch of salt on the data, that China still has had a very impressive recovery. So, in that sense, it could suggest maybe, a slightly smaller degree of damage to like long-run growth, at least kind of maybe compared to other countries that are suffering obviously a much longer duration shock, which kind of raises the risks of kind of damage developing through hysteresis in the labour market and other points. So I'd maybe pick up a couple of small points as well, which are maybe flattering, I guess, kind of China's recovery. And the first would be the kind of the timing effect. So China went into this crisis first. It kind of shut down its manufacturing earlier. Then, as the Western economies were effectively being kind of forced to shut down their manufacturing, China was able to kind of step into the gap, fill some of that demand by exports. And also, I guess, the nature of the shock. People can't go out and spend on services and restaurants and so on in the West. So, we have seen this relatively strong rotation within Western economies, still suffering from the shock towards goods consumption rather than services. And again, China seems to have been particularly well placed actually in this front to kind of service. I guess you could think of this as a crude two-pronged service, kind of servicing work from home demand, your desks, your monitors, and so on, and then also PPE equipment too. So, in this crisis, China's actually gained market share quite noticeably through exports. And then just one kind of smaller point, China has got a big kind of negative tourism balance most of the time. All these Chinese tourists have kind of had nowhere to go. That's also given a sort of a relatively small boost to, I guess, kind of both the current account and also kind of GDP growth as well. But I totally agree with Tom's point about the dangers to kind of long-run growth via kind of accelerating deglobalization trends.
I think it also, if we sort of take a slightly longer historical lens, I think it also speaks to the sort of the learning capacity of China's policymakers, right? So if we go back to the SARS crisis, 2003, China's policymakers just did not manage the healthcare response to SARS in an effective way. And as a consequence, that disease spread. And whilst the consequences of it were never as severe as COVID, China was sort of severely criticized for not being able to contain it, not sharing information domestically or internationally in a transparent way. They were dependent on foreign sort of medical advice and imports to kind of to manage it. In 2008, in the Great Financial Crisis, China's stimulus response was effective in the sort of narrow sense that it saved them from a recession, but it was also massively overdone and left them with this huge legacy of debt. Fast forward to 2020 in the COVID shock, the healthcare response in China was very effective. In common with the Japanese and the Korean governments, they contained the COVID spread very quickly. They have some. I'm not obviously an expert in pharmaceuticals and vaccines, but I understand there are some Chinese companies that have made that have a chance of producing a vaccine. Certainly not something which would have been conceivable in 2003. So on the healthcare response, it speaks to how quickly China's kind of manufacturing technology has advanced and how their policymakers have learned about how to contain a crisis like this. And on the stimulus response, they've managed to get the economy back to life with a much smaller slug of stimulus than they used in 2008.
Tom, I was wanted to follow up a bit on your point about kind of doubling GDP by 2035. I mean, you said you're kind of a little bit more on the kind of optimistic side for Chinese long-run growth. But I guess what are you kind of looking for here that would make you like much more confident that China's not going to get stuck in the middle income trap? Can they rebalance and grow while kind of keeping financial risks contained?
So one thing which gives me confidence about China's medium-term growth prospects, and it's so obvious that people don't mention it or sort of look past it, is just the enormous size of the Chinese economy. It's such an obvious point that Adam Smith actually mentioned it in his book, The Wealth of Nations. He said, paraphrasing, China is so big that they can achieve enormous economies of scale. And when they start engaging with the world and learning from foreign technologies, the combination of foreign technology and China's enormous economies of scale is going to be difficult to beat. And in my mind, that remains the Chinese development model, right? Get some foreign technology or increasingly develop some technology at home because China's own universities and firms are increasingly innovative. Put that to work in a protected, enormous domestic market, achieve world-beating economies of scale, and then start exporting and taking global market share, right? That's basically the model. And because China's GDP per capita is still around a third of the level in the United States, that suggests that there's still just a lot of room for that model to continue running, right? A lot of new technologies they can absorb or replicate, and a lot of market that they can seize at home and globally. So that's kind of the intuition behind my sort of higher degree of confidence in China's medium-term growth prospects. Things that would sort of increase my confidence, well, we've got a Biden administration. Well, we'll see. It looks like we're going to have a change in administration in the United States, and the orientation of the United States and its allies towards China is going to be important. Are we going to see a US administration that continues with a very hawkish stance on China and potentially attempts to block the flow of ideas and technologies into the Chinese market? Or are we going to have a US administration that does a bit more sort of walking and chewing gum, right? Attempting to sort of contain China in some respects, but work with them constructively in others. If the US stays very hawkish, then that would limit China's capacity to absorb foreign technologies, learn from foreign ideas, and that would be one factor which gave me pause for thought about confidence in the medium term.
We're going after China in the wrong way. China is stealing intellectual property. China is conditioning being able to do business in China and based on whether or not you have 51% Chinese ownership. That's got to end. I've spent a fair amount of time when I was vice president with President Xi because the president wanted me to get to know him. He's no Democrat with a small d at all.
And Tom, which of those sides of the debate vis-a-vis the US-China relationship do you ultimately come down on? I mean, it seems to me like Trump has permanently changed. He's moved the Overton window such that the US now is in strategic competition with China, whether it's whoever is the president. No longer is it the old Washington consensus of accommodating China's rise and perhaps hoping at some point that they have some kind of democratic transition on the way as well. The rules of the game now are strategic competition, even if President Biden wouldn't go about it in quite the same way as President Trump did through tariffs and sort of attacks via Twitter. Is that how you see the relationship, or are you expecting it to revert to something that we were familiar with, a decade or so ago?
Yeah, I don't think we're going back to the sort of period of welcoming China's rise. I'm sure many of you, you've seen the Pew survey, which came out recently, which surveyed public opinion across the US, Europe, North Asia on China, and there's really been an extraordinary shift in public opinion. Quite a large majority of public opinion across all of the countries which Pew surveyed now has an unfavorable view of China. I think that's going to mean that that's reflective. That's going to be reflected in a sort of continued policy shift. So I think Donald Trump the Donald Trump presidency has been a period of kind of unusual volatility, right, in China relations and in lots of other respects. The diplomatic guardrails have come off, and so we've had lots of surprises. I think under a Biden administration, the diplomatic guardrails are going to come back on, so we're going to have less surprises. But I suspect that the strategic orientation, viewing China as a country which in some respect is a strategic competitor, which is a strategic competitor with the United States, in some respects a threat, is going to stay in place.
So why don't we end with a final question then? China has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. That's, I think, an extremely welcome policy aim. But let's talk about whether it's, one, achievable, and two, how much it would change the growth model as you've described it, Tom, which up to this point has been fairly carbon and energy intensive, albeit less so over time. So is that a plausible aim?
One additional reason for optimism about China's medium-term growth prospects is that China needs to go through a series of transitions, but all of these transitions are complementary, right? So China needs to move from a credit-intensive growth model to a credit-light growth model. That's the kind of debt management, deleveraging part. China needs to move from a carbon-intensive to a carbon-neutral growth model. That's the environmental sustainability, climate change part. China needs to move from low-value-added industry to high-tech industry and services. China needs to move from the state sector as the main sort of producer of output to the private sector as the main producer of output. But all of these transitions kind of support each other, right? The services sector and high-tech industry are less credit intensive and less carbon intensive than heavy industry and state-owned enterprises. So when you make that transition from heavy industry to high-tech and services, you are also making a transition from credit-intensive growth and carbon-intensive growth to credit-light and carbon-light growth. The other point I would make on this, which I think is an important one, and the US looks forward to a new administration, is the fight against climate change is good for everybody, but it is better for some countries than it is for others. So China, India, they face much larger costs in the decades ahead from climate change than the United States and Europe do. That's a function of their geography, other things. China and India also face higher costs if the transition to carbon neutral is badly managed on a global scale than the US and Europe do. And so what that means is you have a kind of extremely complicated prisoner's dilemma where everyone benefits if there's a cooperative approach to the fight against climate change, but some countries benefit more than others. In particular, China benefits more than the United States. And given the sort of the geopolitical dynamics with this growing rivalry between China and the United States over who gets to be the biggest economy and who ultimately gets to be the biggest geopolitical force, that makes it a very sort of complicated negotiation.
Bob, final word to you.
Yeah, I guess I've taken a little bit of a kind of silver lining, if you will, from the environment. First of all, I think it could potentially provide a bit of common ground for the US and EU and China to diffuse some of the tensions, and clearly that's more viable talking point in a sort of Biden presidency compared to a Trump one. But I think it's still a kind of helpful avenue for diplomacy potentially, regardless, I guess, of whether you believe China can become carbon neutral or get close to it, and under something that is kind of close to the time frame that they're talking about. I think at this stage that the figures that are being floated around for the kind of cost of turning China green are, they're fairly staggering, clearly massively uncertain at this stage. But I've seen a couple of numbers out there, in the range of sort of 15 to 20 trillion dollars. Now that's a lot easier to swallow if China continues to grow a fairly rapid pace. But if this starts looking like it's having a higher price tag, it's like it was going to be really interesting to see whether this kind of green policy line holds, particularly if doubts are starting to creep in at all about China's growth trajectory. There's one reason, though, I think, to think that it might well hold. And then it's the green agenda potentially allows the government to keep its fairly, current investment-heavy policy framework intact. Again, kind of giving it this room to keep a powerful investment lever in its policy toolkit. And as we've been discussing, strength and kind of the immediacy of China's policy levers has been one of the key reasons for its resilience. So it really remains to be seen whether the Chinese Communist Party is kind of willing to give those up. And more generally, for anyone who's experienced an air apocalypse event anywhere in the world, it's pretty hard to argue against clean air.
Tom Orlik, Chief Economist at Bloomberg, author of China, the Bubble That Never Pops. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Robert Gilhui, our senior EM economist as well. And as ever, if you're enjoying Macro Musings, consider subscribing, giving us a like or a retweet. But until next time, thank you for listening and good luck out there.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.